They said the desert kept secrets better than the sea. In Dry Ridge, where the wind swept dust through abandoned corrals and the sun cracked the earth like old porcelain, that was true enough. It was the kind of place where a stranger's story ended in silence, unless, of course, someone was bold or broken enough to tell it themselves. Clara Bell stepped down from the coach in a faded blue dress, hem-stained from travel, hands trembling as they clutched the handle of her small trunk. Her face, though young, bore the tale of fire. A swath of scars bloomed from her left jawline to just under the ear, pale and angry against sun-kissed skin. She kept her chin high, even when the whispers started. Children stared. One boy pointed. A woman turned away with a muttered prayer, as if scars could leap from skin like curses. Clara walked through it all, expression set not in defiance, but endurance. She had survived worse than stares. Clyde Thatcher stood near the livery stable, twirling a toothpick between his teeth. The saloon owner had a reputation for smooth talking and rough fists. He'd written for her, promised work, perhaps love. When his eyes landed on Clara, they narrowed. The toothpick froze. "Hell," he muttered, then louder. "You didn't say nothing about being damaged." Clara stopped in front of him. "Your letter said you wanted a strong woman. I am that." His laugh cut sharp through the air. "I wanted strong, not scorched. Folks'll think I took in a ghost. Go back where you came from." "I spent every cent getting here," she said, voice steady. "Not my problem." He turned on his heel. "You're not what I ordered." And just like that, Clara Bell became no one again. She found shelter in the old chapel at the edge of town. The stained glass was mostly broken, the altar charred black from a long-forgotten blaze. But the roof held against the wind, and Miss Nettie, the preacher's widow, brought bread and a worn quilt. Clara thanked her with soft eyes, and when alone, she whispered prayers with no expectation they'd be heard. She spent her days repairing what she could, sweeping dust from corners, resetting loose stones around the chapel's border. It gave her purpose, something to shape besides her thoughts. At night, she wrote letters in a battered journal. Letters never meant to be sent. To her younger self, to her mother lost in the fire, to a man she'd never met who might one day see her as more than the skin she wore. She didn't cry. Not once. Clara Bell had cried everything out years ago, when smoke took the people she loved and left her behind with only embers etched across her cheek. The town learned to ignore her, the same way they ignored broken fence posts or how the church bell no longer rang. Children stopped pointing. Adults stopped whispering. She became part of the scenery. Until the cowboy came. He arrived on a bay gelding with one bad leg, and a wolf dog pacing beside him. Tall, lean, with a face carved in shadows, he rode past the saloon without a glance. No name was given, no greeting offered. Folks called him Ghost Rider, because stories had long outrun truth. He camped near the chapel, under a dying mesquite. Clara watched from the broken doorway as he built a fire and fed the wolf dog from his own tin plate. He didn't speak until the third night. "You live in a church, or just haunt it?" he asked, voice like gravel over leather. Clara didn't answer right away. "Same as you live in the dirt." "Fair." He tipped his hat. "Elijah Kane." She considered not giving her name, but something about his tone, dry, patient, familiar with pain, made her say it. "Clara Bell." "Miss Bell." He nodded, then went back to feeding the fire. The next morning, she found her woodpile stacked twice as high. A rhythm formed. They shared coffee, sometimes silence, sometimes stories, though never the ones that mattered most. Elijah didn't ask about her scars, and she didn't ask about his limp. She watched the way he moved, deliberate, like a man who'd once been fast and now took his time only because he had to. His wolf dog watched her too, with yellow eyes full of questions it never asked. One evening, he sat on the chapel steps and thumbed through her journal. He'd found it where she left it, on the bench by the altar. "You write like someone who still believes in mercy," he said, voice low. Clara didn't try to take the journal back. "I believe in honesty. That's harder than mercy most days." He nodded. "That it is." The next day, he brought nails, planks, and a hammer, replaced the chapel's door. When a local ranch hand spat too close to Clara in town, Elijah stood between them, eyes flat as old iron. The man backed down without a word. People began to talk again, but this time with uncertainty. Whispers about the ghost cowboy and the scarred bride in the church, about the strange partnership that didn't look like charity or pity, but something steadier. Then, one morning, Clara woke to gunshots in the distance. A rancher rode into town half dead and screaming that the Varnett brothers were near again, a gang known more by legend than face, said to have buried gold and revenge in half the territories west of the Rockies. She watched from the chapel steps as the sheriff barked orders with a shaking voice, and Clyde Thatcher suddenly remembered how to be loud. No one mentioned her. No one asked Elijah, but he stood quietly by the church fence, hand on his holster, looking west. Clara walked up to him slow. "You know them?" she asked. His jaw worked. "I've met their kind. Men who burn what they can't steal." A pause stretched long between them. "I don't plan to run," she said. "Didn't reckon you would," he replied. The wind shifted. The desert held its breath. And just like that, Clara Bell stepped out of the ashes once more. This time, with someone who saw her not as broken, but as someone shaped by fire and still standing. Elijah Kane was the kind of man who could be mistaken for a shadow, quiet, patient, and hard to shake once he settled into a place. He had come to Dry Ridge years ago, a stranger with more silence than belongings, and never left. Not when the mines dried up, not when the railroads turned westward, and not when the outlaws began sniffing around like wolves at a dying campfire. The townsfolk stopped asking questions after a while. Elijah wasn't the kind to offer explanations, and people were too tired to demand them. He lived in a squat cabin on the edge of town, near the canyon pass, where the sun bled red against the rocks every evening. No one knew where he came from. He spoke rarely, drank even less, and spent most of his time tending to an old Mustang with a limp and a handful of goats that didn't seem to mind his company. Some whispered he'd once been a lawman. Others swore he was running from something he'd done. But none of them ever saw him raise his voice or his hand, until the day Clara Bell arrived. She stepped off the stagecoach with a trunk too big for one person and eyes too wary for someone still young. The town had been promised a bride from back east, sent for by a widower named Harlan Finch, who had more money than sense and fewer manners than teeth. But when the coach door swung open and Clara stepped down, scar and all, Harlan took one look and spat into the dirt. "This ain't what I ordered," he said. The townsfolk laughed nervously, but no one stopped him when he turned away. No one but Elijah. He had been leaning against the rail post outside the smithy, arms folded, hat pulled low. When Clara stumbled, trying to steady her trunk, he stepped forward, took the handle, and lifted it like it weighed nothing. "She yours?" he asked Harlan without looking at him. Harlan bristled. "She ain't now." Elijah's jaw tightened. "Then she ain't anyone's but her own." He turned to Clara. "Come on." That was the last anyone saw of Harlan Finch. He left 2 days later, muttering about defective merchandise and the mad dog who'd embarrassed him. Clara didn't seem to mourn his absence. Elijah gave her a place to stay in the abandoned schoolhouse beside the chapel. He didn't offer her kindness in the way others did, with platitudes or pity. Instead, he gave her silence, space, and a sense that she didn't have to explain herself. For someone who had been defined by the stories others told about her scars, it was a rare kind of mercy. They fell into an easy rhythm. She swept the chapel and scrubbed the floors while he brought tools and repaired what rot had touched. He taught her how to use the old stove, how to shoot a rifle without bruising her shoulder, and how to string a wire fence with hands that didn't tremble. At first, they spoke only in fragments. "How long you been here?" she asked once. He shrugged. "Long enough." "You planning on leaving?" "No." And that was enough for both of them. But as weeks passed, the air around Dry Ridge began to shift. There were more boot tracks than usual along the ridge trail. Smoke on the horizon that didn't belong to any known homestead. Stories drifted in from ranchers out east. Towns sacked. Men strung up, women taken. The Varnett gang was moving west. Clara asked the townsfolk if they were preparing, if the sheriff had a plan. She was met with shrugs, nervous glances, and one too many comments about how trouble usually passed us by. She brought it up to Elijah one evening, while he sat sharpening a knife on the chapel steps. "They're coming," she said. "You can feel it." He nodded. "I know." "Then why's no one doing anything?" Elijah stopped sharpening and looked up at her. "Because they think someone else will." "Like who?" "Me," he said simply. She stared at him. "And will you?" He returned to the blade. "Not alone." Clara crossed her arms. "I thought you didn't want to get involved." "I don't," he said, "but I reckon I'm already standing in the fire." That night, she sat by the window of the schoolhouse, watching the stars through glass, smudged with years of dust. She thought of the look on Elijah's face, calm, sure, unshaken, like he'd stood in fire before and didn't flinch from the heat. He had never asked about her scar. Not once. Not even when the preacher's wife whispered about how it must have been punishment, or when the saloon girls avoided her like she carried something contagious. Elijah never pitied her, never studied her too long. Instead, he taught her how to survive, how to shoot, how to stay still when the wind shifted, how to look a man in the eyes and make him blink first. And in return, she began to understand him. The way his shoulders stiffened when riders passed too slow through town, how he always sat with his back to the wall, the way he checked the horizon every morning like he expected it to bleed. Elijah Kane was no savior, but he was something just as dangerous, someone who'd survived long enough to stop pretending that justice came easy. The following week, they found a rider hanging from the cottonwood at the edge of town. A message carved into his chest: "We're coming." Panic bloomed like wildfire. Families began packing. The sheriff boarded up his office and vanished under cover of night. No one saw which direction he rode. The town was leader. They came at sunrise. The Varnett brothers, 5 in number, rode in under a sky bruised with morning haze, their silhouettes framed by the rising light, like devils pulled from smoke. Dust kicked up in their wake, a red storm that clung to the wind and stained every window they passed. Flint Varnett rode at the center, gold spurs flashing with every step of his black stallion, a cocky grin slicing across his scarred face. His brothers flanked him, grimy, brutal, their weapons worn from use, not age. Dry Ridge stood still as stone. The sheriff was nowhere in sight. They dismounted in front of the saloon, boots thudding against the ground like drumbeats of war. Flint looked around as if inspecting cattle, chewing a matchstick and dragging his fingers along the rail post. "Pretty little town," he drawled. "Shame if it forgot how to say please." Clyde Thatcher stepped forward, trying to wear the weight of authority. He held a shotgun across his chest, but his hands shook, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. "We don't want trouble," he said. "You got no quarrel here." Flint's eyes glinted. "We always got a quarrel. Question is whether it's worth settling with bullets or gold." One of the brothers kicked in the sheriff's door with a lazy boot. Inside, they found nothing but dust and a badge on a hook. Flint grinned wider. "Looks like the law got wise and left." From the shadows near the chapel, Clara watched. Her breath was steady, her fingers wrapped tight around the worn grip of the rifle Elijah had cleaned the night before. She stood between broken pews now turned barricade, the chapel's interior lit with quiet candles, and the scent of sage burned low in a tin. Elijah knelt beside her, sharpening his knife with calm precision. He hadn't spoken much since the riders appeared, but his silence was thick with purpose. "They'll demand tribute," Clara said quietly, "then burn the town for sport." Elijah nodded. "They want a story to tell in the next town, about how Dry Ridge rolled over. Then we make sure they leave with a different story." He met her eyes, and something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, or trust worn smooth by fire. That afternoon, the Varnetts called a meeting in the saloon. Flint stood atop a whiskey barrel and declared himself the town's new authority. "Here's the bargain," he shouted. "You bring me all your coin, your gold, your guns. We take what's owed and move on." Someone asked what owed meant. Flint answered by shooting a hole through the piano. Clyde tried to intercede, to negotiate, but they dragged him out and tied him to the water tower, more symbol than threat. A warning, not a casualty, yet. The townsfolk gathered outside the chapel by sunset. They came with uncertain eyes and empty hands. Clara stepped into the doorway, her scar red in the torchlight, voice clear and unflinching. "You know me," she said. "You turned from me when I arrived, but I stayed. I built something here." Her voice didn't waver. "You all watched me live like a ghost. Now I'm asking you to live like men and women again. Stand up. Fight. Not for pride, but so you don't have to look at your children and say you did nothing." A silence fell heavy. Then Miss Nettie stepped forward, rifle in hand. One by one, others followed. Elijah stood at the back, arms crossed, and gave the smallest nod. Clara had become more than a scarred bride. She was fire reborn. That night, the townsfolk moved like ghosts themselves, placing barrels, hiding fuses, positioning lookout posts along Red Hollow Trail. The dynamite had been buried in crates left over from the mine, covered in tarps and dust. Elijah laid the charges himself, with Clara watching every step, memorizing where the blast lines met. At dawn, Clara walked into town alone. Her dress was clean, her hair braided back. She carried nothing but a worn satchel. The Varnets sat outside the saloon, drinking from stolen bottles, laughing like they owned the dust. "Well now," Flint said, standing, "if it ain't the lady of the chapel." Clara stopped 3 feet from him. "You want gold," she said. "I'll take you to it." The laughter slowed. Flint stepped closer, teeth flashing. "And why would you do that, sweetheart?" "Because I'm tired of cowards," she said, "and you strike me as someone too stupid to look a trap in the mouth." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Flint grabbed her arm. "You got stones, I'll give you that." He nodded to his men. "Let's go." They followed her out of town, past the blackened fence posts, toward the hollow trail that led into Red Hollow Canyon. Clara walked ahead, dust kicking up at her boots, her pulse steady with every step. Half a mile in, Elijah waited behind a rock wall, his finger on the fuse. Clara paused where the trail narrowed, the cliffs rising steep on either side. "This is it," she said, loud enough for the canyon to carry. Flint frowned. "I don't see gold." She turned to him and smiled, wide and fierce. "You won't." She dove left, tucking into a crevice, just as Elijah lit the line. The blast cracked like thunder. Rocks tore from the canyon walls, crashing down in a storm of stone and fire. The echo rolled for miles. Dust swallowed the Varnet gang, their horses screaming, men shouting, scattered in panic. Clara crawled from the crevice coughing, hands scraped raw, but alive. When the dust cleared, 3 of the brothers were pinned or unconscious. One had fled down the canyon, blood trailing after him. Flint Varnet lay stunned, legs trapped beneath rubble. Elijah stood over him a moment later, gun drawn. "You got a name?" Flint rasped, spitting blood. "I did," Elijah said, "but you made me bury it." He raised the revolver, then paused. Clara stepped beside him, rifle steady. "Let him live." Elijah's hand didn't tremble, but his eyes darkened. "You sure?" She nodded. "Let him tell the next town what happens when you come for a place that's ready." Elijah holstered the weapon. Flint Varnet was left breathing, but broken. Back in Dry Ridge, bells rang for the first time in years, hammered by children too young to remember their sound. Clyde Thatcher was cut loose. He didn't speak, just packed his bags and left at dusk, face pale, pride broken. No one stopped him. The town gathered at the chapel that night, under stars brighter than they'd ever seemed. Some prayed. Others just stood in silence, not needing words to mark what had passed. Elijah sat on the chapel steps, staring out at the desert. Clara joined him, the moonlight catching the silver thread of her scar. "You didn't kill him," she said softly. He glanced at her. "You didn't either." She shrugged. "Some wounds heal slower than bullets." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. The fire had returned, but this time Clara Bell stood at the center of it, not as something to be feared or hidden, but as its master. The morning after the Varnets were driven from Dry Ridge, the town felt quieter than it had in years. The wind still whispered through the canyons, but the whispers now carried a different tone, one of hard-earned peace, brittle but real. The sun rose sluggishly, casting a golden hue over the town, its rays cutting through the smoke of the previous night's chaos. Clara Bell stood at the chapel door, watching the horizon. Her scar, her history, glowed faintly in the light, no longer something that made her feel small, but something that gave her weight. Elijah Kane stood beside her, his silhouette a familiar shadow against the fading night. His weathered face remained unreadable, but there was something in his posture now, something steadier than the tense figure who had once ridden into town. He didn't need to speak for her to understand that the ghosts of his past were still there, lingering like smoke. But for the first time in a long time, they seemed to be fading into the distance. They had won, but Clara knew that victory was never as simple as it seemed. The Varnets might be gone, but men like them never truly disappeared. They just scattered into the dark, waiting for the right time to rise again. Still, for now, Dry Ridge was safe. The townsfolk had gathered in the town square by midday, murmuring in groups, catching sight of each other as if for the first time. The morning's hush had given way to a ripple of quiet celebration, tempered with wariness. It was a new chapter, but no one was sure yet what the first page would look like. Elijah moved through them with his usual quiet purpose, heading toward the far side of the square, where the old mine had once stood. Clara followed. They didn't need to speak to know where they were going. There were no more secrets between them, only the understanding that there was still work to do. "You think they'll come back?" Clara asked as they approached the mine's ruins. The old structure was little more than splintered wood and shattered stone now, but its foundations remained solid. It had been the source of the town's wealth before it had burned. The fire had taken more than buildings. It had taken hope, a cruel reminder that no one was truly safe. Elijah didn't answer immediately. He surveyed the landscape, his eyes narrowing as they swept across the hills in the distance. His fingers twitched at his side, where his holster used to rest. "They always come back," he said at last, "but not the way they expect." Clara didn't question him. She understood. A place like Dry Ridge didn't forget easy. People like the Varnets didn't vanish because they were driven off. They left behind scars, and scars didn't heal unless you kept pressing on them. Elijah was right about that. The two of them stood in silence for a long while, watching as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The town behind them was beginning to settle into its rhythm again, but it felt different now, as if the air itself had changed, carrying a weight of recognition. They had faced something, both of them, together, and had come out the other side with scars that would never fade. But those scars had become part of who they were, part of what they had built. Elijah had taught her that, in the days since the Varnets had left, how to face the things that hurt, to look them in the eye and say, "You don't own me." She had learned it quickly. The sound of hooves interrupted their reverie. A rider came from the east, moving fast, his silhouette growing sharp against the afternoon light. He wore a dust-covered hat and a long coat that billowed in the wind. As he drew closer, Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had seen that gait before, long, easy strides that made no noise. No need for a swagger. Just a man who walked through the world as if it were his to move around, but never to control. It was Clyde Thatcher. His face was hard, set in a way that made it impossible to read. The anger that had burned in him when he'd first confronted her was now replaced by something else. Resignation, perhaps, or maybe guilt. He reined in his horse, his eyes flickering between Clara and Elijah before he dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. "You," he said, pointing at Clara. "You're the one who did it, aren't you?" Clara didn't flinch. She had already told herself that one day someone would ask. "I did," she said simply. "Didn't think you had it in you," he muttered, almost to himself. Not after everything." "I'm not who I was," she said, her voice steady. "No one is." Clyde nodded slowly, his gaze turning toward Elijah, who stood silent, arms crossed. "And you," he said, almost a challenge. "Did you teach her how to fight?" Elijah's lips twitched at the corners, the ghost of a smile. "Didn't need to." She already knew. There was a long pause. Then Clyde snorted, shaking his head. "Figures. Maybe it's true what they say about folks who come from places like this." "What's that?" Clara asked, her eyes narrowing. "That folks who survive for a reason. and that reason's always stronger than the ones who think they can take it. Clara considered the words carefully, and when she spoke, her voice was low, almost amused. You've got a point, Clyde, but you're not the one who's here now, are you? He hesitated, then shifted his weight, uncomfortable. No, I guess not. Then what's your business here? Elijah asked, his tone sharp now. The quiet man with the hard past didn't take well to games, even when they were dressed in regret. Clyde shifted again, looking down at the ground, unwilling to meet their eyes. I came to apologize, he muttered, for how I acted, for what I said. I was a fool. Clara tilted her head slightly. A fool who left us to die. He flinched, but didn't look away. Yeah, he said, voice thick. A fool. I didn't see it then, but I see it now. And that makes it right? Elijah's voice was cutting now, the sharp edge of a man who'd fought too many battles to let a false apology slide. No, Clyde admitted, his voice breaking slightly. It doesn't. But I came to tell you, and to tell this town, that I was wrong. I should have stood with you. Clara was quiet for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle. Then she looked at Elijah, who was watching her carefully, waiting for her judgment. It's not for me to forgive, she said softly. But this town might. She turned to face Clyde, her expression unreadable. You'll have to earn it. Clyde nodded stiffly. I'll do whatever it takes. He turned and walked back to his horse, but before he mounted, he looked back once more. I'm not asking for redemption, just a chance to do better. The dust settled as Clyde Thatcher rode off, but his words hung in the air, a challenge left for the future. Elijah and Clara stood there for a long while, silent, the weight of the day pressing down on them. The sun was high now, and the town behind them seemed to hum with the energy of what had been won. Clara glanced at Elijah, who was watching the horizon, his expression unreadable once again. What happens now? She asked. Now, he said, his voice low. We wait for the next legend to write itself. And together, they turned back toward Dry Ridge, where the sun set behind them, painting the world in the colors of hope, and the scars they carried burned a little brighter, a little stronger.